Hello, everyone. This is the first recording Zoom lecture for believers in intelligent leadership. This recording will go through some background information on the history of Cuba and the United States relationship, really since the Spanish-American-Cuban War. And go through up to the recent demonstrations they've had there. And just to give you some idea of some issues, some topics, some events that you may not be aware of that kind of led up to this point that we're at now in the history of the foreign policy. One of the most important things about Cuba and the United States is what led up to the revolution. And you need to always keep this in mind when you think about the relationship of the United States and Cuba. Because before the revolution, whenever there's a revolution in the world, there's some reason that people who basically have been living in poverty and in a system of inequality decide to stop what they're doing and fight against the government or against whoever's repressing the people and controlling the system. It must be pretty important for them to risk their lives. People in the world now get to a point where they're hopeless, and not only are they hopeless for themselves, they're also hopeless for their children's future, and that might even be more important. So you can go back and read this. You can stop this video. You can go back and analyze things that I said, and I'm happy if you want to fact check me. I've been doing this same lecture for 22 years pretty much. So I'm happy to discuss any of this information. So the point being is that revolutions happen for a reason. And when you think about people fighting in revolutions, they really have to be at the end of their rope. And that's pretty much what happened with Cuba at that point. So remember, before the 1959 revolution, 75% of the rural dwellings were huts made from palm trees. More than 50% of the people had no toilets of any kind. 85% of the people had no inside running water. 91% of the people had no electricity. There was only one doctor for every 2,000 people in rural areas. And now Cuba has more doctors than per person, per capita than the United States does. More than 1/3 of the rural population had intestinal parasites. Only 4% of the Cuban peasants ate meat regularly. Only 1% ate fish, less than 2% eggs, 3% bread, 11% milk, and no one ate green vegetables. So there was a shortage of food. Now there's a reason for this. After the war, the Spanish-American-Cuban War, the governments that were installed by the United States and supported by the United States actually really were dictators up until the Cuban Revolution. And they didn't care about the people of Cuba, the 11.5 million people in Cuba. And they pretty much looted and sacked the country for a period of about 59 years, from the time of the Spanish-American-Cuban War to up until the revolution. And the Cubans call it the triumph of the revolution, by the way. That's just the word they use. Anyway, so to continue this list, again, you can come back and read this because this is the most important information you're going to get out of this lecture, this first page. What caused the revolution? What causes people to stop farming, stop their lives, and fight to the death? You have to ask yourself that question. Most of us have never been in that situation. So you have to ask yourself, how bad does it have to be before you give up everything to fight for the future of your children and your grandchildren? It's a really important question. So the average annual income among peasants was $91. That's a year, $91, less than a third of the national income per person. 45% of the rural population was illiterate. 44% had never attended a school. 25% of the labor force was chronically unemployed. 1 million people were illiterate in a population of about 5.5 million at the time of the revolution. And we're going to talk about all these changes that happened since then. 27% of the urban children, not to speak of 61% of the rural children, were not attending school. 61% of the kids in the rural areas not attending school. Racial discrimination, and this is what dictators do. They don't want their population to be educated. They don't want them to be educated enough to get organized to fight back against what was happening to them. Racial discrimination was widespread. The public school system had deteriorated badly. Corruption was endemic. Anyone could be bought from a Supreme Court judge to a cop. Police brutality and torture were common. Okay, so this is just the beginning of what was going on at the time. And I'm going to start right into this short PowerPoint about the information you're going to see here. And I call this Cuba's What's Next because nobody really knows what's going to happen next. A lot of it depends on what the United States decides to do, if it decides to change this relationship. So the geography of this situation is important because Cuba is a natural trading partner for the United States. The United States is an economic system. Cuba really is a social system. So when the embargo began, Cuba begins to be cut off from the IMF and the World Bank loans. They're not able to get loans. They're not able to get medical supplies or food from the United States. And it's basically a sanction and an embargo and it really affects the Cuban people. So this has been going on since 1961. So for 62 years, this has been going on, more or less, from that time period when the embargo was in place. Now, the United States is losing an estimated $3 billion in trade from Cuba. They would have got every year into the Gulf states, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, because of this trade embargo. So we're losers too. Point being is that the embargo is really against the ideology, if you want to call it that, or philosophy of capitalism, that you always trade with your nearest trading partners. Why? Because it's cheaper to transport goods and services shorter distances. It's more efficient. There's more really margin and profit in doing that. And so the embargo itself has really backfired on the United States. And it hasn't done what embargoes and regimes are meant to do, which is to make the people suffer enough that they will overthrow their own government. Another issue here is that Cuba is an island, and islands tend to have a really strong identity. So the Cubans have a very strong cultural identity about what is Cuban. And this is going to help them in the revolution defeat overwhelming odds that they're fighting against, because the entire island of Cuba, because of this strong cultural identity, understood that the leadership in Cuba, in this case, Batista in the 1950s, was not doing anything for the Cuban people and was treating people unfairly. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So why is Cuba important? Look at the presidents that tried to buy Cuba over the years. So 1808, Thomas Jefferson tries to buy Cuba right away. And it's because of its location, its entrance to the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. It's a very important military strategic location. And the United States government realized this very, very early on. And they're going to try the undisclosed sum, Jefferson, it's thought to be about $25 million. So everything goes up with inflation, of course, over the years. But then Polk offered them 100 million, Pierce offered 130 million, and then after the war, or just before the war ended, McKinley tries to buy the Cuba from the Spanish for 300 million. So that being said, it's obviously a valuable piece of real estate, and that has something to do with why Guantanamo is there now. So when the Spanish-American-Cuban War, as the Cubans call it, because the Cubans were fighting too against the Spanish, when it ended, the war itself only went on 3 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. A lot of people don't realize that as soon as the United States got involved, it turned out to be a very short war. And the Spanish said that they would not leave Cuba. It was the last country they would leave. They had made all their riches and money off of sugar from occupying Cuba from really 1492 up until 1898. So for 400 years, they were occupying Cuba and using their resources, growing sugar, profiting off of that, slavery, having slavery be a big part of their economy. And they said it's the last country we'll give up. Slavery doesn't end in Cuba until 1886. Remember our Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, and finally in 1865, slavery ends in the United States. So basically 21 years later, they still have slavery in Cuba. This is another important point. So this relationship goes on. The United States helps the Cubans defeat the Spanish finally and run the Spanish out of this hemisphere. But it had connections attached, including the transfer of Guantanamo and the Isle of Pines and Isla de Juventud to the United States as a portion of the Platt Amendment in 1903. Important because Guantanamo is still occupied by the US military for the sum of $5,000 in gold each year. They were supposed to pay, and they did pay, to rent, lease, whatever you want to call it, the Guantanamo Air Base every year. as soon as Fidel and the revolution is successful in 1959, Fidel receives that $5,000 payment for Guantanamo every year, but he never cashes the check. It's a famous thing that he would throw the check in a desk and a pile of checks would pile up, and he never cashed them because he'd never recognized that the United States had the right to occupy Guantanamo. So this is in 1938. Fulgencio Batista, who's not the president yet, is in Washington with General from the US Army. And this was a time, of course, during the transition of Latin American governments where we supported a lot of dictators who were repressive and repressed their people and were looting their governments and their economies. And that was just what we did. We thought that was the right thing to do to control these countries with strong leaders who were going to use military tactics to control their population. And Batista later on then, of course, in 1953, is going to conduct a military coup, and this is going to trigger the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro's a lawyer at that time, and he is going to start a revolution. He meets Che Guevara in Mexico City, and they bring the grandma a boat over and start the revolution with about 81 people on that boat, beginning with the Moncada barracks attack, July 26, 1953. And so at this time, before the revolution, there are, as you saw on that list, a lot of poor people in Cuba, and they had been ignored by the government for education, for housing, for healthcare, for any kind of services the government might provide. And this had been going on since the Spanish-American War up to 1959, and they had just had enough. So when this revolution begins, and Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos and Fidel Castro, the main generals, began to move across the country from Santiago, the people were in support of this revolution. And village by village, town by town, they got support. So here you can see the sign up there backwards says casino, and the other sign above the tenement there says Westinghouse. So U.S. companies, and here is revolutionaries entering the Havana Hilton on the day of their occupation of Havana on January 1st, 1959, after the triumph of the revolution. And the Havana Hilton was a symbol of United States hegemony and ownership over Cuba. And so they immediately occupied this hotel and renamed it the Havana Libre. This is the Batista's palace that he got run out of on December 31st, 1959. The building itself is about 1920, but immediately, point being is the revolutionaries didn't move into this palace. They didn't move in and take over and become the kings and queens on the thrones. The next day, they turned this structure into the Museum of the Revolution, and it became a symbol, and still is, the Museum of the Revolution. So in the 50s, Batista had been running the casinos while he was looting the country and ignoring the population here. and called in Meyer Lansky from Las Vegas and the Las Vegas mob, to run their casinos, because the Cubans didn't even know how to run casinos. They wouldn't let anyone win at all. And the mob came in and said, no, you have to let people win sometimes, so they keep betting, to even give them that concept of how gambling works. And so the mob came in and entrenched themselves into all the casinos. By 1959, the time of the revolution, American companies and the mob owned 90% of everything in Cuba. This is probably the second most important idea, that countries who are sovereign, independent, and want to be independent countries don't want third countries owning 90% of everything that they have. The oil companies they owned, the Cadillac dealerships, all the hotels, all the casinos, all the gambling, all the prostitution, they owned everything. And so the mob itself lost a lot when the revolution was successful, the triumph of the revolution happened. And that can be a whole other story about what happened after that. But here's are the troops after they're accommodating the shell headquarters in Havana, after they had been repossessed by the government of Cuba. Now, people that were still in Cuba were in cahoots with the government. A lot of them were in cahoots with the government. And those are the people that ended up going to Florida. They didn't just go to Florida. They went to the Dominican Republic and other islands and other countries. They just loaded up their boats with what they had and took off before everything was confiscated. But because of the mistreatment of the Cuban people and the education system and the healthcare system and the situation that had gone on for 60 years, this was the backlash of that. And when you lose a war, you lose everything. The Germans didn't come back to Germany and say, oh, we lost the war, but you know what? We'd still like everything back. We'd still like our territory back. We'd still like our possessions back. We still want our mansions back, etc. No, when you lose a war, you lose everything. And the Florida Cubans still haven't accepted that. As the generations go by and most of the owners that were dispossessed die off, this will probably change over time, and eventually they will lift the embargo. Remember, the embargo every year is voted on by the UN, and because the United States has veto power, the vote this year was 198-2. The two votes that refused to lift the embargo were the United States and Israel. Every other country, 198 countries in the world, voted to lift this embargo for its inhumanity and its treatment of the Cuban people. And the whole concept that sanctions and embargoes can force countries to have regime change and rise up against their own people, it's a bankrupt idea and it needs to end. It's not working, it hasn't worked, and it will continue not working in Cuba until the embargo is lifted. So another super important point. In August of 1960, Fidel Castro, after the revolution is won, comes to the United States to ask for help. Now remember, it was the CIA supporting Batista and the mob and everybody else that Castro was fighting against. So at this time during the Cold War, it would look like they were hypocrites to help Castro at this point. In reality, they probably should have helped Castro. Why? Because they could have basically by now, 60 years later, undermined the entire Cuban economy and the entire Cuban psyche about materialism with capitalism. That's probably what could have happened, and trade, and they would have normalized relationships right away, and the Cubans wouldn't have suffered for the next 60 years, and led up to all of the migrations, we've seen, not only from Latin America, but from Cuba and other places. So he comes for help, he's turned down by Kennedy, and he goes home. I believe the boycott that we have against Cuba is counterproductive, and it also makes the 12 million or so Cuban people suffer unnecessarily because of a foolish policy of the United States. Jimmy Carter's quote, and he's right about everything. So now, in the heat of the Cold War, just after World War II, after the Korean War, with the Vietnam War bubbling at this time in French and Indochina in the 50s, they thought there was the real ideological war going on in the world between capitalism and communism. And so it's hard to know. I mean, at one point in time, we thought slavery, or some people did, thought slavery was a good idea. At some point in time, they thought women not being able to vote was a good idea. So we have to change our foreign policy to be able to react to changing circumstances, so that it will be better really for all of us in the long haul. Why? Because how the Cuban-United States relationship is viewed by all Latin American countries is so important. You cannot put a value on it. Think about it, how if you're a Latin American government country and you think, look how the United States has treated the Cuban people for so long, for no reason. So we get into other situations for 10, 20 years for no reason. This has been 60 years, this embargo of ineffective foreign policy. It's unbelievably painful and disastrous to our history and our legacy in this hemisphere. So there were about 300, still are, 300 main mansions in Cuba that were repossessed by the Cuban government after the revolution. These were all the richest people and the movie stars and the landowners and the casino bosses and really the upper echelon of the Cuban government living in these mansions. They are still there today, but some of them are even Airbnbs. Some of them have been subdivided and they're occupied by 5 families, or they may be even the homes of ambassadors. So again, the Cuban government are not hypocrites. Castro and Raul Castro and Che, they didn't move into these mansions after the revolution, and none of the military people did. There is a lot of buildings that are being degraded. About once every 3 days, one of these buildings falls into the street, just from the salt and sea air. Most of them were built between 1900 and 1920, and they're just getting old construction, but they do look like they're all about ready to fall down, and the only reason they don't fall down is because they're holding each other up, the walls in between buildings. So, but the Cuban government, I mean, they do have no societal system is perfect. But that doesn't mean that the Cubans shouldn't try to make it more perfect, more equal. Every day they are trying to develop. And that goes for the United States or any other country. We should never say it's good enough. We have enough equality. You can never have enough equality. You need to move towards more equality all the time, continuously. So the state is building affordable housing all over the country, in the small towns as well as the cities, for these people. Where their house falls in the street, they can move into these affordable housing apartments immediately. And this is an ongoing project. These houses are being built everywhere now, continuously, for the homeless. They outlawed homelessness in 1960, and they said everyone deserves to have a home and shelter, to be able to take a hot shower, go to work, go to a job interview, be a productive, constructive person. They still have about 27,000 estimated homeless people, but they're always, again, building these housing projects. United States, about 650,000 homeless people. We need to, of course, build more housing projects in our country. This is a social idea to do something for people that need help. There may not be any profit in the short run on it, but there's obviously a social gain in the long run to building affordable housing. So before 2011, you could not buy or sell your house in Cuba. You could only give it to a family member, or women could marry into a family that owned a house. The women still would not own that house. The men owned the house. If a woman got married and moved into her husband's house, that would not have anything to do with her. And it would never have anything to do with her. So before 2011, from 1959 to 2011, they would swap houses. This is a socialist idea. So you're getting older, you have a 2-bedroom on the second floor of one of these houses shown here, and you say, hey, I want to trade for a 1-bedroom on the ground floor so I don't have to walk up these stairs anymore. That's an example. You would just trade houses, maybe there's a little money involved, but nobody really has any money, right, to buy or afford a house. So you would just swap houses. And this went on and on and on until 2011. So in 2011, a couple of things happened. Up until this point too, you could only have one job, because the idea, social idea, is that if you have 2 jobs, you're taking a job away from someone. Now, they have free education all the way through medical school if they want to be doctors. They have, and pass the exams. They have free healthcare, 100%. They have very little in the way of utilities. It's like $10 a month they would pay in utilities. They have a ration card for food. They can get bread, fresh bread every day, and other things at the bodegas, they call them, and all the neighborhoods are discounted heavily. So even coffee, cigars, rice, beans, sugar, flour, things that they need. Oh, cooking oil. They use a lot of cooking oil. And a lot of this has been imported up until this point. But they still have shortages now for 11.5 million people. And COVID has made the whole situation, what was kind of tenuous, pretty much just collapse. So the workers in Cuba do make $20 an hour. I mean, sorry, a month, $20 a month. Now, all those other things I just mentioned are provided for, but to work for the government of Cuba, the idea is that equality doesn't happen automatically. You have to make equality happen. so that everybody's in the same boat, everybody's sharing the labor, everybody's supporting the revolution. The school children learn about the revolution from first grade, and they learn about the first grade, about all the history I've given you so far about how bad it was before and how Batista had to go. And by the way, when Batista left, he took $400 million in 1959 dollars and fled the country. And when he took those $400 million, he ended up going to Portugal, and he died in Spain, 1972. I think he died, yeah, 1972, he died in Spain. So they never did catch up with him, even though they were after him. In fact, it's said that there was an assassination plot on Batista 2 weeks before he actually died. They were chasing him all that time. But what did the Cubans do immediately after winning the revolution? They built 15 medical schools all over the island and in the remote areas and the rural areas and the smaller cities. They built medical schools and they began to train doctors. And they still train doctors all over the world for free. In fact, nurses and doctors from the United States have gone to Cuba to get their training because they can't afford US medical schools. And then they just go back and pass the bar exams for medical school in whatever state they live in. With the idea being that they would go back and practice medicine in underserved areas for people who needed doctors in the countryside. They sent doctors to also to 108 different countries all over the world. They're in Haiti right now. There's Cuban doctors helping with the last earthquake of 2021, the one that's going on now. There are over 60 universities. So the opposite of the country being 45% illiterate, they built a lot of universities. They have 60 now, and they have a 99% literacy rate. Almost everyone can read and write. The United States right now, if you look it up, is only 84% literate. So some of these countries that devote themselves to education, healthcare, housing, social ideas, have a lot, even with lack of resources or loans from anyone else, have a lot to be said for long run stability. Even though COVID is threatening their system right now because they're so reliant on tourism, they have a foundation of people who respect their government. So in the schools, you go into the smallest little town of 15 people, and there will be a teacher teaching 4 or 5 kids or whatever amount of kids. Education, everyone is required to go to school up until the age of, I think it's 18 now. They changed that recently. It was 16, it's 18 now. And if you pass all the exams, remember, you can go to college or medical school for free. And they have great teachers. And instead of having illiteracy, the Cuban government, after the revolution in 1961, went about training 29,000 teachers and sending them into the smallest villages and the smallest towns all over the island to increase the literacy rate, even of adults. They had a literacy program where they were sending 15-year-olds into the countryside to teach adults how to read and write. Very aggressive, and it worked. They're 99% literate. So there has been the idea that Castro turned the country communist, and that he employed communist ideas. In fact, Castro has been tried to be killed by the CIA and other governments 638 times. This is an actual video. You can get on, you might have to buy it on Amazon or on Netflix. It's kind of hard to get, it's kind of underground. But they did actually spend a lot of time trying to kill this guy and to demonize him as a communist when he's doing all these things for his people as a backlash to how they've been treated for so long. So some people call him a dictator. Some people call him a hero. Some people, the Cuban people for the most part, believed in the ideas that he had. And it's why. You say, well, why haven't the Cubans overthrown the Cuban government if it's so terrible? Well, it wasn't that terrible, and it isn't that terrible. They've been repressed and by the embargo, and the economy has been damaged greatly, and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars they've lost in trade because of the embargo. And embargoes, again, you know, it's something that it doesn't work because anytime anything goes wrong in these countries, and that includes Iran or North Korea or anyone else, they can say, look, the United States is causing all your suffering. It's causing all your pain by enforcing their embargo on us, right? So really, it's backfired again in another way. Politically, it's backfired. Economically, it's backfired. It hasn't caused the overthrow of the government of Cuba at all. And here's Che Guevara. Remember the Soviets when Castro gets turned down by Kennedy for help, they have to turn to Russia for help. And Russia decides we're going to make an example out of Cuba. And they supported Cuba. In fact, they paid 3 times more for the sugar than it's worth to help support Cuba through the beginning changes of the Batista years and the presidents before that. All the suffering they'd done, they needed to rebuild the economy. And today they've realized that they can have these urban gardens, and when buildings fall down or they have vacant lots in the cities, they've built these urban gardens all over the place. And in fact, because they can't afford expensive chemical fertilizers, they're having to grow all organic food. And this organic food is the food that's distributed to the neighborhoods, to the bodegas, to the small little markets that they have. Pretty much every 3 or 4 blocks, there's a food market in Havana where 1.5 million people live. A large part of the population lives there. And they save on transportation costs, and they save on moving the products, and all their labor is there. You can work in these urban gardens, and the people who work in these gardens keep 20% of everything they grow. 80% goes to the government for a fixed rate. The cigars are kind of the same way. The cigar growers, they have to sell 90% of their cigars to the government for a fixed price, but then they keep 10%, which ends up being a lot because cigars are valuable and expensive, and they sell them to tourists, of course, when there are tourists there. In fact, the minister of farm and the countryside quit his minister job and was working in one of these gardens because he was making more money and getting more food, better food that way. So People say that the United States or Cuba has a lot of political prisoners, and that we should, not lift the embargo until the Cuban government releases their political prisoners. Well, this guy, Posada Carrillos, should be a political prisoner. He was responsible for the 1976 bombing of a Cuban airliner that killed 81 people back in 1976. And he came to Florida to live with the Florida Cubans, and he was allowed to live there as a freedom fighter. Remember, one person's terrorist, there's another person's freedom fighter. And this guy even admitted to blowing up the plane and being in cahoots with that. And he died peacefully in Florida in 2018, Posada Carrillos. You can look him up. He's a bad guy. And his whole idea was that he was just against the Cuban government and the Cuban Revolution. And he was one of the Florida Cubans who were in cahoots with the Batista government when they left. This is the Cuban Five. These are Cubans that were sent to Florida to try to stop people like Posada Carrillos from bombing Cuba and killing innocent Cubans in Cuba. And the other guys, Posada Carrillos, they were responsible for bombings in front of hotels. Basically, they were trying to disrupt a tourism that was exploding in Cuba in 1998. All kinds of people from all over the world. Every year, there's a lot of people that go to Cuba. But these guys were put in jail for anywhere from 10 to 15 years in the United States as being terrorists, when all they were trying to do is stop people like Posada Carrillos and find out what the Florida Cubans were doing to try to hurt Cuba. And this is the guy, Alan Gross, who got arrested in 2015 in Havana Airport, smuggling in 11 laptops and also phone equipment that would bypass the CIA or bypass the Cuban phone system. And he was arrested as a spy. And a bomb ended up in 2015, 2016, swapping this guy. His health was deteriorating in Cuban jail. I think he was only in jail for a year or so. They swapped him for the Cuban Five in a prisoner exchange that was kind of a detente move to normalizing relations as well. So a lot of people have been leaving Cuba. They're fed up with the embargo. They don't see any future. And there's been quite a few different time periods where people left Cuba, different events that happened. So there's the 1959 to 62 initial immigration from Cuba to different countries, but also to the United States. And then from 65 to 73, there was migration of people. And then the Mariel in 1980 was a big one, 124,800 people. And at that time, because so many people wanted to leave Cuba, got to the point where, and a lot of this has to do with the embargo, they let a lot of people just go. They realized that this could be just a relief valve. If you don't want to participate in the revolution idea and contribute, then leave. And they didn't want really people who weren't going to participate. Balsero crisis, are people leaving on rafts and whatever they could. 30,900 people. In 1994, there's a big migration. And then after the special period, after the Soviet collapse in 1989, Cuba loses like 60% of its productivity because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. They lost all their support, all their subsidies on sugar, and it was really in 1990, from really 95 to 2017, it was a really difficult time. So Cuba depends on tourism. They have to have tourism. And COVID just slammed them at the wrong time. So normally kind of fragile system where they're barely getting by selling things on the street, or and all of the cruise ships and tourism in Cuba kind of fell apart. There's kind of another migration happening now, because it's been difficult to get food, and it's just a worldwide pandemic. So a country that was right on the edge really is being pushed to the limits. So this is kind of a graph of the amount of tourists that were coming before the pandemic. And turns out most of them are Canadian. They get about 1 million Canadians a year. During Obama, there were about 500,000 people from the States going to Cuba on cruise ships and on tours. During Trump, that dropped to about 50,000. So this is very painful to the people, to the cab drivers, to the tour guides, to the people who work in hotels and restaurants and everything else related to tourism. So point being, it's hard to create sustainable tourism if that's all you got, if you're relying on tourism. Costa Rica and Belize have the same issues with relying on tourism. They're not as affected as much because they're not embargoed by any countries, but it really has pushed people to the limit. And that's why you've seen these recent demonstrations in Cuba. They want food, they want equal rights, but a lot of it, almost all of it, can be related to number one, the embargo, and number two, the COVID. Stopping trade. So over time, you can see that trade's kind of creeped up since the 90s, little by little. And again, a lot of this is Europeans and Canadians. And remember that the rest of the world's been going to Cuba since the beginning. It's only tourists from the United States that don't go to Cuba that much. So that started to pick up during the Obama years. And then, of course, it started to drop off during the Trump years. And they really rely on, they become reliant on tourism for a lot of their income. So in 2015, Obama goes to Cuba to try to normalize relations and try to reverse this idea that economic sanctions will lead to regime change and a revolutionary overthrow by the Cuban people over the Cuban government. And to say, look, we can normalize relationships, we can begin more trade, we can have a better relationship. Now, all of that, of course, would improve the relationship with all of Latin America. It's a better idea, it's a better way forward. Continuing to embargo Cuba there's no future in that. It hasn't worked for 60 years and it's going to continue not working, would be my estimate. You know, there needs to be change. No system, no social system is perfect. Why? Because it's created by humans and humans are imperfect and they're never going to have a perfect system. The idea of equality in Cuba and to create a system where all boats will be floated equally and all people would share in the profiting of Cuba's advancement and development, it probably will just take longer. 60 years isn't long enough. If the embargo hadn't been enforced, it might have happened already. But they'll continue to blame the embargo for everything. So in August of 2016, John Kerry, there pictured with his head to the sky, was at the US Embassy when they raised the flag again and opened the US Embassy. Now this is before COVID, of course. Embassy's closed now. But interestingly enough, the Marines that lowered the flag in 1962 when the embassy closed are the same Marines that raised the flag in 2016. So just a fascinating little piece of history there. And, you know, normalizing, again, relationship with Cuba, all the good it would do for our relationship of all of Latin America, really can't be measured. So they will continue to blame the blockade, the embargo, until the blockade is lifted. And that's never going to change over time. They always have this to rally nationalism and actually, even though it's not a communist system, even though they call themselves a communist party, the Cubans are actually less than 10% communist. They're also less than 10% Catholic. That's a whole nother lecture, but they're not exactly what they seem to be in Cuba. It's a real dynamic cultural mix of people that's interesting. They have not deserved to suffer for one day because of this blockade. And hopefully soon, there will be some kind of epiphany of our government. It may take a president like AOC, an Hispanic president, or somebody who speaks Spanish to understand Latin America finally in our foreign policy. But let's hope that comes someday for all of us. It'll be a better world. It'll be a better hemisphere. Thanks.